Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning and welcome to our Hollister Power Breakfast. I'm Diane Scuban, the WCA Marketing Manager for Hollister. First of all, I'd like to thank Wounds Canada for putting on yet another wonderful conference. So thank you very much to Miriam and her wonderful team who actually helped us out this morning. And in my hometown, no less. I don't want people to walk away thinking that Mississauga is only about an airport. It's a lovely city, so I hope you have a chance to get out and see some of it. So just a couple of things before we get started. On your tables, you'll find some evaluation forms, and I'd really appreciate it if you could fill them out at the end of the session because it only helps us do better next time. So please take a moment to fill those out before you leave, and then we'll collect them from the center of the tables. And as a little token of our appreciation, the lit up flutes on your tables, please take one on your way out as well, and hopefully it'll make your day a little blue. Also, you'll notice on your tables we'll have 5 lucky people who are actually going to win digital thermometers. So you'll see on your folders there's a ballot. If you could complete those, bring it back to our Hollister booth. And we have a ballot box there for you, and we'll be doing a draw at 4:30 where Kevin will come back and draw 5 lucky winners. So please be there to collect your prize. So now I have the privilege of introducing our guest speakers. First, we have Kevin Wu. Dr. Wu is an assistant professor at Queen's University School of Nursing in Kingston, Canada. He's currently one of the leading wound researchers in Canada with over 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals and contributions to numerous wound textbooks. Dr. Wu maintains his clinical expertise and functions as an advanced wound consultant at the West Park Health Centre and Specialized Chronic Care and Rehabilitation Hospital in Toronto. Additionally, he's the web editor for Advances in Skin and Wound Care journal website, and he's a member of several editorial boards. Also, we have our very own Tarek Alam. Tarek is the Clinical Affairs Manager at Hollister, focusing his time on research, education, and clinical practice. He's an adjunct clinical professor at the University of Western Ontario in the Masters of Clinical Science Wound Healing Program, and he lectures in the Department of Nursing at Dawson College for continuing education at John Abbott College, both in Montreal. Okay, so our topic today is managing infected wounds and biofilms. What have we learned in the past year? And our session objectives will be to provide an overview of new evidence on wound infection and biofilms, to discuss approaches to assessing infection in chronic wounds, and to review one of Hollister's solutions to infection and biofilm management. Enjoy the morning.
Thank you, Diane, and it's nice to see so many of you here, early birds. And I still have a voice after the partying last night, so nice to see you here. So I think this is my disclosure in terms of my connections and working relationships and collaborations with other companies as well. So I think to start, I think nothing better than talking about biofilm for breakfast, right? And so basically, just want to highlight the wound bed preparation again. Really is the foundation for our approach to the chronic wound management. Whether wound infection biofilm is the key focus or not, I think this is the way that we always use to look at chronic wounds. And what you can see here under local wound care, after we have addressed the etiology and patient-centered concern, there are 4 different boxes here: debridement, and sometimes we use the term desloughing and removal of the devitalized tissue. The concepts are very, very similar. We want to clean off the wound base. And then the second box is about control infection, and I would add probably address biofilm problem in the local wound environment. And then the third box is about moisture balance. So the wound is a very dynamic environment, so all those concepts and all those approaches has to be modulated from time to time to address the chronic wound needs. This is the 2016 updates from Now Wounds Canada Best Practice Recommendations, looking at a different framework to guide clinicians how to approach chronic wound management. So you may ask what's new since we have this document. And I think I'm going to highlight some of the terminology related to wound infection continuum. I'm not quite sure how many people had gone to the session from the Wound Infection Institute. And a lot of the material is basically extract from that document to highlight some of the sort of emerging concepts and perhaps some controversies around how we approach chronic infection and biofilm problem as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about biofilms and looking at clinical evaluation of wound infection, what's the best approach that we should take. And then finally, we're going to highlight the prospective study on chronic wounds using the infection checklist and also a antimicrobial dressing. And this is probably one of the very controversial definition around what is chronic wound. And by definition, we agree that it is a wound with very slow progression through the healing phases, delayed or stalled. And this is one of the complaint that Dr. Houghton has always raised, that we don't really have a very good benchmark to evaluate what is considered as a normal progression. In Ontario, that you're aware that a lot of times we use this 30% for 4 weeks of healing as a gauge to see whether the wound is progressing in an expected trajectory. Well, that may not always be applicable. That may not always be the best benchmark for all the different types of chronic wounds out there. And that's why a lot of research and a lot of, actually, a number of students from the Western program, they're actually picking up on the project to look at systematic reviews, looking at different data to answer the question. So perhaps we can come back to talk to you about what is considered as the normal progression of a healing wound. And I think we understand that, and we can agree on the fact that most of the chronic wounds, why they're not healing, is because of biofilm problem. And that's why, wounds do not always follow this predictable pathway, and they often get stuck in this inflammatory phase because all this bacteria they're producing proteases stimulate your body to produce protease as well, and making the wounds more difficult to heal. This is a diagram that we modified from the International Wound Infection Institute. So basically, you can see the continuum here from contamination, colonization, and as the bacteria continue to proliferate, causing host injury, now we consider local infection has occurred, and then eventually the bacteria can invade into the deeper compartment, causing spreading infection or systemic infection. So I think it's nice that we're no longer using terms like, critical colonization, because actually no one actually understood what that word actually conveyed. So this is nice to have a more streamlined approach to explain and also describe what's going on in the wound environment. As you can see, for contamination and colonization, we have to think about best practices, infection control practices to prevent and also to minimize contamination. Versus with local spreading and systemic infection, the recommendation from the Wound Infection Institute is to look at aggressive, regular maintenance, continuous debridement, and also the use of antimicrobials. And I think this is a lot of debate about, so how much do we debride, how often and how long should we be using antimicrobial agents, and that remain to be, we need more evidence to validate some of those questions. This is a nice diagram to illustrate what a biofilm is like. And you can see it's like a big tower of bacteria. And as the planktonic state of bacteria become, when they aggregate, when they get together, they produce those glycocalyx material to protect themselves. And they can exchange genetic material, making them stronger and more resistant to antibiotics and also to our antibodies as well. And based on some of the understanding, and very consistent with the Wound Infection Institute, we divide wound infection into the upper compartment local infection versus spreading infection in the lower compartment. So, at least from my clinical experience and my practice, is when there is a local infection, we have to think about the use of topical antimicrobial agents versus when infection is in the lower compartment. Remember, a lot of the agents that we have right now, they're not able to penetrate into the deeper tissue. So whatever you use, if you're handling a situation with deep infection, antibiotic is really required. So I think the recent updates on wound biofilms, a few key points here, that biofilms cannot be visualized. There's a continuous debate and conversation about, well, I see all those slimy stuff, is it biofilm? Well, remember, yes, when you see sloughy tissue, when you see those slime gelatinous material, it's likely that you have biofilm in those devitalized tissue. But just because you cannot see devitalized tissue, just because you cannot see the slimy stuff on the wound surface, you cannot rule out the presence of biofilm. So I think it's a good statement to understand that you cannot visualize biofilm in the wound. And after you have a chance or an approach to clean off the biofilm, without any intervention, the biofilm can reform within about 2 to 3 days after debridement. And again, this is based on some of the in vivo study. And some of the latest literature and the document by Dr. Great Scholes and the group international panel of wound experts and microbiologists, and they actually have some data to show the diversity of bacteria and sometimes organisms and pathogens, because it's not just about bacteria now, it's about the presence of fungus, the presence of other types of organisms that will help build a stronger, more resistant biofilm structure. And I know that there's a lot of, I was talking to Rajani and actually to the Karen Cross from St. Mike's, that looking at some very interesting microbiome projects to look at the type of bacteria on the skin or in the wound environment. And because different types of bacteria in the ecosystem can develop different types of biofilm, and perhaps we have some better answers to tell you in the future. Well, if we can analyze the type of biofilm, we can actually predict what's happening to the chronic wounds. And the other point that we like to make is about the devitalized tissue or sloughy tissue in the wound environment. This is where the biofilm is more than likely to grow and proliferate, because basically the devitalized protein is a very good source of food and the area for the bacteria to grow. And the duration for how long we should be using topical antimicrobials and antibacterials, I think that is a debatable issue as well. So topical antimicrobials and antibacterials may be used after debridement to prevent biofilm reformation. We have shown to the earlier bullet, within 2 to 3 days, those bacteria can easily grow back to where it was before. The debatable question is, how long should we be using antimicrobials? If the consensus is most chronic wounds, about 80 to 100% of chronic wounds have biofilm there, if we stop using antimicrobials, those bacteria is going to come back to reform the biofilm. Is it appropriate to use antimicrobials continuously or for prolonged duration of time? So I think that's another question that we need to answer in the future, because I think some people, there's two camps of people. Some people say, well, if we use antimicrobials for too long, are we facing a resistance problem? Are we facing a problem with the issue of cytotoxicity? Versus the other camp of people who say, well, you do need to use it continuously in order to keep all the bacteria under control. So unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer to you today, but something to think about. If the wound is on a normal healing trajectory, perhaps it is wise to continue with the antimicrobial agents or with your current treatment plan until you see the wound get stalled again and change the plan. Of course, another challenge clinically is to determine whether wound infection is a problem. And when you look at this diagram, this picture here, do you think the wound is infected? What do you think? Think.
Is it warm?
Is it warm? Good question. Yes. Well, you need more data, right? So if we tell you, and this is actually Jolene Hiles' case, and in a study that we completed a couple of years ago, and basically there's increased exudate. It is slightly warm, and it's actually malodorous as well. So anyway, so perhaps, what about this one? Doesn't look so good, eh? Yeah, the tissue, the granulation tissue look a little bit dusky, doesn't look very healthy. So perhaps there's infection, local infection problem. But remember, a lot of wounds may not produce those signs, subtle signs that we consider to be diagnostic or considered to be evaluation criteria for wound infection. So in this case, people with a diabetic foot ulcer with poor circulation, they may not produce signs like this that we see. Yes, there is definitely an infection problem with increased exudate, smell, and pain. And that's why sort of we looked at the literature and summarized some of the key evaluation parameters and trying to make it easier for people to remember. So this is called the upper and lower checklist, and I think you actually have a copy of this in the cue card in your package as well. And it's been translated in French, and I think the Quebecois is happy with the translation. And basically, when you're looking for local infection, look for signs such as unhealthy tissue, when the wound is not really improving. So again, for lack of a better benchmark at the moment, we still look at the 10% for every week or 30% for 4 weeks at the moment. And hopefully, we can be informed by more evidence in the future to change the criteria. When there's a new and increased level of pain, increase and change in the quality and characteristic of exudate and smell, usually that is a warning, those are the warning signs telling us that there may be a local infection problem. Versus when the wound is getting bigger, and sometimes you may see satellite lesions around the wound. And when you can probe down the bone, although the research is done in people with diabetes and diabetic foot ulcers, but I think from clinical experiences, when you have pressure ulcers, when bone is exposed, or you can probe down the bone, always think about the possibility of deeper infection and have a proper evaluation of osteomyelitis. And other sort of more classical signs of soft tissue infection with increased warmth, edema, and increased erythema. And we talk about erythema is, more than 2 centimeters beyond the wound margin as the indication of acute inflammation. So how many of you are using temperature as a criteria for your evaluation? Oh, there's quite a few of you. Excellent. Hey, I think a few years ago when we asked people in the crowd, there's only 2 hands, but now we actually have a critical mass to change practice. I think this is a very, very useful tool. All right, and again, there's a number of different devices out there, and actually Tarek is going to talk to us about some of the devices and how that can be used for the evaluation of wound temperature.
Thank you, Professor Wu. I think that the reality is that infrared digital thermometry has been used in clinical practice for many years. However, the gold standard, the Exogen digital thermometer, was not accessible for many, mainly due to price. So in 2005, Mufti, Coutts, and Sibbald, I think, published a landmark article, and that validated the use of 4 commercially available infrared digital thermometers for measuring skin surface temperature associated with deep and surrounding wound infection. These thermometers are readily available across Canada. For example, the Mastercraft digital infrared thermometer on the top right retails for approximately $100, but often will go on sale and can be found at approximately a quarter of the price. So now we have tools that can be used with infection checklists, such as the upper-lower, that are readily available to us as clinicians. I encourage you to review this landmark paper because it really helps guide clinicians on the safe and effective use of these infrared thermometers in clinical practice. All of you, just as a reminder, have a ballot on the table, and if you fill up in the ballot and come by our booth, drop it in the ballot box. Today at 4:30 we'll be having some draws for infrared digital thermometers, and you have to be at the booth at 4:30, but I encourage you to come by and have a chance to win one. But let's go back to basics.
I guess basics would be me. So I think we have to look at when we approach chronic wounds. So again, this is modified from some of the best practice recommendation, the biofilm-based wound management. So you always suspect that there's a biofilm present in a chronic wound environment. I think when you look at the expert panel on biofilm, and 100% of the experts would say when wounds are chronic, you can suspect biofilm with very, very high level of confidence. And then the routine, really, the best practice approach to the chronic wound is really looking at debridement. I think if every chronic wound is colonized or if affected by biofilm, then you do need to think of different ways of cleaning the wound and have this continuous approach of debriding and removing all the slough and devitalized tissue in the wound environment. And remember, after the disruption of your biofilm, think about the use of topical antimicrobial agents to prevent those bacteria from coming back. And following that is the continuous reassessment, so complete this cycle of local wound care. So Jolene and I actually had finished this study a couple of years ago. It's a prospective evaluation of methylene blue and gentian violet dressing for the management of chronic wounds. And all those wounds actually had signs indicating local infection. This is a protocol. It was a 4-week prospective study, non-randomized clinical trial, and we'll come back to talk about the evidence and how case studies can help inform practice after this session, because I'll be on another panel to have a little debate about the quality of different types of evidence out there. But coming back to this study, we had 29 patients. They were 18 to 85 years old and chronic wounds, and meaning that they were there for about 3 to 4 weeks with signs indicating local infection. And the highlight here is we didn't do any debridement, sharp debridement or mechanical debridement on those wounds. So we just want to see what the dressing can do on those chronic wounds that we're concerned about. So this is a patient after amputation and 4 weeks after post-op in Providence Care. And the wound size was 8.3 by 4.5, high level of pain, and 8 out of 10 is pretty bad. Large volume of exudate, it was smelly, and using the thermometer, there was at least 3-degree difference between the two legs, indicating there's acute inflammation locally, and in combination with all the other signs here that would suggest it may be a local infection. So I think what we've learned from the evaluation too is you don't just look for one sign indicating local infection, because there's no one sign that is the most reliable and most valid criteria. So we often combine the different parameters to confirm or to validate the presence of local infection. So after 2 weeks of using the methylene blue gentian violet dressing, there was a 18% reduction. And what you can see here is, and Jolene took this picture with the intention to show people that The blue dressing, you can see lots of sloughy tissue on the dressing itself. You can see the wound base is much cleaner, so suggesting there is some desloughing capacity that able to remove all those devitalized tissue, cleaning off the wound base. And by removing the sloughy tissue, devitalized tissue, you're actually disrupting the biofilm structure at the same time, or removing some of the biofilm. So I think that's the next phase of research, hopefully. I think I was talking to Dr. Evans in terms of looking at the next phase of project is to evaluate, is there any sort of evidence of biofilm in those dressings, and what type of biofilm is being removed by the dressing. And also, you can see that there are some changes in terms of signs and symptoms associated with local wound infection, decrease in drainage, edema, there was no odor, there was no temperature difference after 2-week use of the dressing. This is another case, a very interesting case as well. It's a stage 4 pressure injury. In the right IT area, 7 by 5 by 4, it's a pretty big wound. And there was some undermining and toward the more distal area, 1.8 centimeter of undermining. And there was a lot of purulent exudate and smell coming from the wound. And they were actually using calcium alginate, and which is kind of the standard that we use for the management of a deep pressure injury, because people think about packing, right? But the problem with packing is depends on the type of material. Some of the material have a tendency to lump together, creating a mass that potentially can cause injury and pressure to the wound surface. You can actually see the area in the 3 o'clock in your picture. There is a local injury there with the darkening of the wound edges, indicating that that there is potentially a problem, pressure applying to the wound edges, making it look like a deep tissue injury locally. So, of course, with the availability of the dressing and the injury, so and she changed the dressing to the methylene blue. After 2 weeks of treatment, there was a 20% reduction in size, with improvement in the length of the undermining, decrease in drainage, odor, and now the pain. There was because of the spinal cord injury, she was not able to assess pain. But you can see in this picture, there's a significant difference in terms of the quality of tissue on the wound surface. And you don't see the darkened area anymore. So I think that's a very good lesson learned, that the foam dressing, the material is like a memory foam that is able to accommodate the pressure appropriately and without causing excess pressure to the edges or to the wound base. Week 4, and you can see a 50% reduction in wound size. There's no undermining anymore, and you can start looking at actually, she basically had to open the wound up to actually take this picture because the wound edges are really advancing, closing in, and there's actually still able to achieve a very good moisture balance. And often, I think, in the study, what we use is we use the classic hydrophilic blue or the gentian violet methylene blue dressing. And depends on the type of exudation. We often use a very simple dressing just to provide a cover to secure the methylene blue gentian violet dressing. So at the end, after looking at 29 patients, we're able to achieve and demonstrate a significant reduction in wound surface from 21.3 centimeters square for all the 29 patients. At the end of the evaluation, the average surface area was 12.4. And I think we were quite impressed and surprised by the fact that there was a significant improvement in the tissue quality, especially with a cleaner wound base. You can see the significant reduction in the mean percentage area of the devitalized tissue covering the wound base. from 50% to only about 11%. So there's an 80% reduction over time. And I think it highlights the capacity for the dressing, probably because of the capillary wicking property. They're able to suck out all the vitalized tissue, and along with it, a lot of bacteria and the biofilm structure that is being removed with the dressing. And perhaps that is the reason why we see a significant improvement in the healing outcome, because a lot of the dressings, a lot of wounds that we evaluated, in fact, number of other antimicrobial dressings were used to manage the healing process, and we're able to accelerate the process by changing the treatment plan.
Thank you, Dr. Wu. I think this study is a great example of collaboration between industry and clinicians who are in active clinical practice. For example, we had some research questions on this dressing technology, and we put forward these questions to some clinicians. Professor Wu and Jolene Heil were able to answer our questions through an investigator-initiated trial, meaning that once we agreed upon the research questions and the study design was determined, it was a completely hands-off study. And this was recently published in the International Wound Journal and is an open access article. Hydrophera Blue Classic is an absorbent, antimicrobial, or antibacterial foam dressing that contains polyvinyl alcohol foam with methylene blue and gentian violet. Effectively, it can absorb bacteria, exudate, and other debris by its wicking action, which rapidly wicks the material into the foam dressing away from the wound. Interestingly enough, it also disrupts biofilm, and we know that through a recent systematic review and meta-analysis that involved 9 studies, over 185 chronic wounds, found that 78% of these wounds contain bacteria biofilm. And we do know that biofilm in wounds are known to form on and associate with slough and devitalized tissue. Therefore, Hydrophera Blue Classic manages exudating wounds and may aid in the removal of devitalized tissue from the wound bed. As this action occurs, Hydrophera Blue Classic dressing helps disrupt the biofilm that is associated with slough and devitalized tissue. In this conference, we're very pleased that we have some clinical posters that are available for viewing. Dr. Perry Meyer and his colleagues have a poster on the use of Hydrophera Blue and the edge effect. Karen Laforêt and colleagues has some health economic data on the use of the dressing in a community setting. And Rosemary Hill did a case series on the debridement-like effects of Hydrophera Blue on various wounds in a acute care setting. So I encourage all of you to go and meet with the researchers and see their posters and their research that is being presented here. There's evaluation forms on the table. We would appreciate if you can fill them out. We'll collect them after the session. This helps us come back and present new and exciting evidence to you. Please come by our booth during the 2 sessions, and remember to fill out your card to win an infrared digital thermometer. So I think what we've done in closing is we've provided an overview of some new evidence on wound infection and biofilms. We've looked at different approaches to assessing infection in chronic wounds, and all of you in your package have the upper and the lower infection checklist scores in your package. And lastly, we've looked at one of our technologies which can provide a solution to infection and biofilm management. I think there's some key takeaway points here. Use a validated infection checklist to differentiate between local and deep infection. This can be done through upper and lower. For biofilm management, select the appropriate antibacterial or antimicrobial dressing based on the form and function in your clinical needs and what's available to you. And lastly, removing devitalized tissue and slough debridement will only benefit the wound. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dr. Kevin Wu for joining us this morning, for all of you to come out on an early morning. Thank you.